Hello, my friend, and welcome to Historian Sleepy Channel. Tonight we step into a medieval village just as winter begins tightening its cold fingers around the fields, the roofs, and every unfortunate person who's forgotten how precious a bundle of dry stick can be. You smell damp earth, wood smoke, sheep, old straw, and something from a cooking pot that has been bubbling long enough to become legally mysterious. Frost gathers along the lane. Chickens complain with professional dedication. Somewhere behind a cottage wall, an axe strikes wood, pauses, then does not strike again. That silence matters, because tonight your village is running out of firewood, and unless you possess the survival instincts of a suspiciously competent peasant, you probably won't survive this with your modern dignity intact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from. Along with your local time, it is always pleasant to imagine this sleepy little gathering stretching across different countries and different hours. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You push open the rough wooden door of your cottage and immediately understand why the hearth matters so much. The room is not pleasantly rustic, it is cold. The walls are made from timber framing packed with a mixture such as clay, straw, and other local materials. Gaps appear where the building has shifted. The roof above you may be thatched. The floor beneath your feet may be packed earth, glass windows, if your household has anything resembling them at all, are expensive luxuries. More likely, small openings admit light, drafts, and the occasional deeply ambitious insect. At the centre of ordinary life sits the fire. It warms your hands. It cooks your food. It heats water. It dries wet clothing. It gives you light once daylight disappears. It produces smoke that curls upward, hopefully toward an opening in the roof, although some of it prefers your lungs because medieval architecture enjoys keeping expectations modest. You crouch beside the hearth. Only 3 split logs remain. Yesterday, perhaps, that would not have frightened you. A woodland lies beyond the fields. Trees have always stood there. Branches fall. Shrubs grow. People gather sticks. Wood seems as natural and permanent as rain, but now the little stack beside the wall looks painfully small. You pick up one log and feel its weight. Dense hardwood burns longer than a bundle of thin twigs, and in cold weather that difference matters. A household cannot simply keep throwing large logs into the flames whenever somebody feels chilly. Fuel requires labour. Someone must cut it, gather it, carry it, season it, protect it from rain, and somehow prevent children, neighbours, servants, livestock, and bad weather from turning the supply into a disappointment. Most medieval villagers do not live beside unlimited, untouched forest. That image belongs more comfortably in legends. Across much of medieval Europe, woodland is intensely used. Trees provide construction timber, fencing material, tool handles, carts, agricultural equipment, animal fodder, charcoal, and fuel. Woods can also support grazing animals, especially pigs feeding on seasonal mast such as acorns. A tree is therefore not simply scenery. It is almost a vertical warehouse, and everyone wants something from the warehouse. You step outside and walk toward the shed where your household keeps its fuel. The door groans open. The sight inside is worse. A few crooked branches rest against the wall. A bundle of brushwood lies beneath them. Some pieces are damp. One has fungus growing across the bark with such confidence that you briefly wonder whether the fungus now owns the property. You count again. There is no hidden pile. No forgotten reserve waits beneath a cloth. The household supply that looked adequate during late summer has shrunk far faster than expected. This is how a fuel crisis begins for you. Not with a dramatic announcement from a herald. No bell rings. No official rides into the village square shouting that civilization has misplaced its trees. Instead, you notice small absences. The pile beside the house is lower. Your neighbour stops lending bundles. Children return from gathering with thinner armfuls. The easy deadwood near the lane disappears. People begin walking farther. That last change is especially important. Firewood is bulky and heavy compared with the amount of heat it provides. Carrying it by hand is exhausting. Moving it by cart requires an animal, a cart, usable roads, and time, so the practical value of woodland depends greatly on distance. A beautiful forest 10 miles away may comfort a poet. It does not necessarily warm your soup. You follow a narrow path beyond the last cottages. Mud grips your shoes. In summer, the walk feels ordinary. In winter, every extra 100 paces becomes an argument with gravity. You reach the familiar edge where villagers have gathered fallen branches for years. The ground looks strangely bare. You search beneath thorny bushes. Nothing useful. You move toward an oak. A few tiny sticks lie among wet leaves. You collect them anyway. There is dignity in medieval rural life, certainly, but there is also a great deal of bending over for disappointing sticks. The shortage becomes visible because everyone is searching the same landscape. You're not alone in needing fuel. Every cottage contains people who must cook. Every household needs heat in severe weather. Bakers need ovens. Brewers require heat. Blacksmiths depend heavily on fuel, especially charcoal in many settings. Craftsmen may need wood for particular processes. The manor consumes resources. The church needs repairs and warmth. Wealthier households often use more fuel simply because they possess larger rooms, more servants, and fewer philosophical objections to comfort. Competition accumulates quietly. A village of perhaps a few dozen households can place enormous pressure on nearby woodland if demand repeatedly exceeds regrowth. That does not mean medieval people blindly chop down every tree in sight. Woodland management can be sophisticated, and many communities understand perfectly well that careless cutting creates future trouble. But knowledge does not magically create trees. Poor harvests, population pressure, unusually cold weather, local construction, warfare, expanding farmland, commercial demand, or bad management can all intensify scarcity. You return toward the cottages with a bundle so small that even the family goat seems judgmental. At the doorway, somebody asks whether that is all you found. You say yes. There is a pause. That pause tells you more than a village meeting could. People have begun expecting bad news. Inside, you place the thin branches near the hearth and inspect the flames. One log burns slowly. The outer surface blackens. Orange light flickers across a cooking pot. You resist the urge to add another piece. This is the first real adjustment. You wait. You become attentive to fire in a way modern life rarely demands. A flame is no longer background atmosphere. It becomes arithmetic. How much wood remains? How long will this log burn? Will you need heat tonight? Can dinner cook with the embers? What happens if tomorrow brings snow? You start noticing details you normally ignore. A poorly dried log hisses and smokes. Thin branches catch quickly but vanish quickly. Large pieces take more effort to ignite. Hardwoods often provide longer, steadier burning than many lighter woods. Every choice changes what remains for later. Medieval households can spend a remarkable amount of labour simply securing basic energy. Historians studying pre-industrial societies often emphasize that fuel availability shapes ordinary life because nearly every warm meal and heated room depends on stored biological energy, usually wood or something derived from plants. You're living inside that calculation now, and winter is only beginning. Outside, dusk arrives early. You hear another villager chopping somewhere nearby. The blows are slow, then they stop. A woman passes carrying a basket filled mostly with thin brush. A child follows with twigs tucked beneath one arm. Nobody looks relaxed. Even the village dogs appear concerned, although to be fair, medieval dogs generally look as if they have recently received troubling financial news. At supper, the household gathers close to the hearth. The pot contains something thick, warm, and practical. You do not complain. Complaining requires calories. Someone mentions that the usual gathering place has been picked clean. Someone else says the woodland farther uphill still has fallen branches. Another person immediately points out that walking there takes much longer. Then comes the uncomfortable question. Who actually has the right to collect wood there in medieval communities? Access to woodland can depend on a complicated mixture of custom, lordship, tenancy, local privilege, and specific rights. One person may have permission to gather fallen branches but not cut living timber. Another may possess rights connected to particular land. Rules can vary enormously from place to place. A curious historical tidbit hides inside the vocabulary of these rights. Medieval records sometimes distinguish very precisely between kinds of wood gathering, because a fallen branch, a cut branch, and an entire tree can represent legally different things. Your evening fire, in other words, may depend on terminology. Nothing makes winter cozier than property law. Historians still argue whether many local medieval woodland crises were driven primarily by genuine physical scarcity, or by unequal control over resources that made existing supplies inaccessible to poorer villagers. In reality, the two problems often overlap. Trees may remain in the landscape while the people who need them most cannot legally reach them. But tonight you do not conduct an academic seminar. You stare at the flames. One collapses into glowing embers. The room darkens slightly. Someone reaches for another log. A hand stops them. Not yet. The words are quiet. You suddenly understand that your household is no longer using firewood normally. You're rationing it. That realization travels through the village house by house. Doors close earlier to preserve warmth. People linger beside dying fires. Wood piles receive suspicious glances. A stack that once represented routine preparation now looks like a countdown. You step outside once more before sleep. Cold air presses against your face. Above you, the sky is hard and clear. Stars shine over the dark outlines of trees in the distance. There are still trees. That is what makes the situation so unsettling. The landscape does not look empty. No desert surrounds you. No catastrophe announces itself. Yet the useful, reachable, permitted supply of fuel is becoming dangerously small. Behind you, smoke rises thinly from cottage roofs. Each little plume represents wood disappearing. You listen. No axes now. Only wind moving through branches, the faint movement of animals in their pens, and the soft crackle of fires being deliberately allowed to shrink. Your village is not frozen. Not tonight. But everyone has begun counting sticks. And once an entire community starts counting sticks, winter suddenly feels much longer. You wake to the sound of chopping somewhere beyond the houses, but the rhythm does not suggest abundance. Each strike is deliberate. Each branch that falls already seems claimed. The mystery of the missing firewood becomes less mysterious when you begin following where all that timber has gone. You start with breakfast. A pot hangs above the hearth. Water must be heated. Grain must be softened. Pottage must simmer. Yesterday's food may need warming. Even the simplest meal asks something from the woodpile. Then comes the midday meal, then supper, then hot water, then warmth when the weather turns bitter. A single household may burn only modest amounts at any one moment, but repetition is merciless. Multiply those fires by every cottage in the settlement, then by every day of the year, and suddenly the woodland is not supplying a few cosy hearths. It is feeding an entire energy system. Wood is the medieval world's quiet engine. You cannot plug anything into a wall. There is no gas line beneath the road, no fuel truck arriving with reassuring paperwork. No mysterious button labelled heating that causes invisible machinery to solve your problems. If you want heat, something must burn. Usually that something begins as a tree. You walk past a cottage being repaired and find another reason the woodland is thinning. A carpenter is shaping a beam. The beam is thick, straight, and valuable. It may become part of a roof frame or support a wall. Smaller pieces of timber sit nearby waiting to become pegs, boards, handles, or braces. A medieval village consumes wood not only by burning it, but by building with it. Houses need structural timbers, barns need posts, sheds need rafters, doors need planks, carts need wheels and axle, ploughs need wooden components, buckets, bowls, stools, chests, ladders, and countless ordinary objects begin with wood. Even if many of these things last for years, they eventually split, rot, warp, or break. Then they must be replaced. You watch a man shave curls from a length of ash using a sharp tool. The shavings fall like pale ribbons. Nothing is wasted if people can help it. Small offcuts may reach a hearth. Broken objects may eventually become fuel. But first, the village wants the strongest timber for useful things. That creates an important division in the woodland. Large, straight trunks are valuable construction material. Smaller branches and undergrowth are valuable fuel. The same tree can be wanted by several people for several entirely different purposes, and everybody believes their purpose is the sensible one. You move toward the fields. Here the pressure becomes easier to see. The village needs fencing, a lot of fencing. Animals wander if given the opportunity, and medieval livestock possess exactly the same respect for property boundaries as livestock today, which is to say almost none. Cattle must be controlled, sheep must be directed, pigs must be kept out of places where their agricultural enthusiasm would be unhelpful, gardens must be protected, young crops must survive. A fence may be made from woven branches, stakes, rails, hedges, or combinations of materials depending on the region and available resources. Every repair takes more wood. Storms knock sections down. Animals damage them. Posts rot in wet ground. Someone backs a cart into a fence and suddenly an afternoon disappears. You bend beside a recently repaired section and notice dozens of cut rods woven between upright stakes. None is large. That is precisely the problem. Fuel shortages are not caused only by grand trees being felled. Thousands upon thousands of small cuts matter too. Every rod in a fence is one less branch available for burning. Beyond the fields, you notice patches where woodland gives way to open ground. This is another major pressure. Farmland feeds people. As population grows, villagers often seek more arable land. Trees are cleared, shrubs are removed, roots are dug or burned out. The soil is turned toward grain production. At first, clearing woodland can actually provide a temporary flood of fuel. Suddenly there are trunks, branches, stumps, and brush everywhere. For a few seasons, people may feel rich in wood. That abundance is deceptive. Once the land becomes permanent field, the trees no longer regrow there. You have exchanged a renewable source of fuel for crops. The decision may make complete sense. A family cannot eat a beautiful stand of oak trees, no matter how inspirational the view. But every acre cleared changes the village's future fuel balance. During periods of medieval population expansion, especially in parts of Europe between roughly the 11th and 13th centuries, large areas of woodland are cleared for settlement and agriculture. This is a mainstream feature of medieval economic history. Growing populations create demand for more fields, more buildings, more tools, and more fuel at the same time. You can almost hear the woodland losing the argument. Food comes first, then shelter, then warmth. Unfortunately, all three compete for the same landscape. You continue toward a smoky patch near the edge of the trees. The smell changes. It becomes deeper, heavier, almost metallic. A charcoal burner is working. This profession can transform ordinary wood into something enormously useful. Charcoal burns hotter and more cleanly than raw firewood in many craft applications. Smiths value it. Metalworking depends heavily on concentrated heat. Certain industrial processes need temperatures that a casual domestic hearth cannot provide efficiently. The charcoal burner stacks wood carefully, covers it with earth or turf, and controls how slowly it burns. The goal is not to let the wood vanish into flame. The goal is to heat it with limited oxygen so that much of the moisture and volatile material leaves behind carbon-rich charcoal. The process is slow and requires experience. Too much air and the pile burns away. Too little control and the result can be poor. You stand at a respectful distance because ruining several days of a charcoal burn is an excellent way to become unpopular. A quirky detail is that charcoal burners often work in woodland for extended periods, watching their clamps or kilns at strange hours. In folklore and local imagination, their smoky camps can acquire an almost mysterious reputation. People living near the woods may see them as half craftsman, half creature of the forest, which is probably what happens when your workplace continuously smells like a dragon's kitchen. The practical problem is less romantic. Charcoal requires wood, a great deal of it. The conversion loses mass, so whenever nearby towns, smithies, workshops, or estates demand more charcoal, the pressure on managed woodland can intensify sharply. Now add baking. A village oven may serve multiple households, especially where authorities regulate baking or where a large communal oven is more efficient than dozens of smaller ones. Bread needs heat, the oven must be fired, then brewing. Ale is not merely festive decoration in medieval life. Brewing is a substantial household and commercial activity, and heating stages of the process requires fuel. Then lime burning. Lime is useful in mortar, plaster, and agriculture in some settings. Producing it can require intense heat. Then pottery. Then brick making in places where bricks are used. Then salt production in some regions, where brine must be heated until water evaporates. Suddenly the woodland is supplying not just homes but crafts, construction, food preparation, and local industry. You begin to understand why the trees disappear without anyone needing to be especially foolish. Each individual demand seems reasonable. That is what makes the problem dangerous. One family takes a bundle for cooking. A carpenter selects timber for a roof. A farmer repairs a fence. A smith buys charcoal. A baker fires an oven. Yet a lord expands a building. A group of villagers clears another patch for grain. Nobody wakes up intending to create a fuel crisis. The crisis emerges from ordinary decisions accumulating across years. You step farther into the woodland. The oldest trees stand scattered rather than dense. Around some of them, young shoots rise from cut stools where trunks have been harvested and allowed to regrow. Elsewhere, branches have been removed repeatedly. You can read human activity in the shape of the trees. This is not untouched wilderness. It is a working landscape. A forest can look green and still be heavily exploited. That distinction matters. Modern eyes may see leaves and assume abundance. You look for usable fuel. The answer is more complicated. Young shoots may need time. Large timber may be reserved. Certain trees may belong to someone else. Some wood may be unsuitable, wet, inaccessible, or needed for another purpose. A landscape can contain trees while still failing to provide enough convenient household fuel. Then there are animals. Pigs are famously driven into certain woods to feed on acorns and beech mast where customary rights allow it. Livestock may also browse young growth. Goats in particular possess a talent for treating future vegetation as today's snack. If animals repeatedly eat fresh shoots, woodland regeneration can suffer. The tree that might become fuel in 10 years never gets the chance. You look at a browsing goat. The goat looks back. Neither of you apologizes. Weather adds another complication. A cold sequence of winters increases demand. Long wet periods make drying fuel harder. Storms may provide fallen wood. but they can also damage roads and make transport difficult. A poor harvest may push villagers to expand cultivation. Political instability can disrupt carefully managed systems. War can consume timber for fortifications, repairs, transport, or military needs. No single explanation fits every village. Historians still argue whether medieval woodland decline in many regions is best understood primarily through population growth, expanding agriculture, commercial demand, local institutions, climate pressure, or combinations that vary dramatically from one place to another. That debate matters because medieval Europe is not one uniform ecological story. Some regions experience severe woodland pressure. Others maintain substantial forests. Some communities regulate cutting successfully. Others struggle. Some landlords protect woodland because timber is valuable. Some villages defend customary access because survival depends on it. You do not need the entire continent to run short. You only need your local supply to fall below local demand. That is the cruel arithmetic. A forest 50 miles away does not solve tonight's cooking problem. Even 5 miles can be too far if roads are poor. Carts are scarce, and every journey costs hours of labour. By late afternoon, you reach a clearing where several stumps reveal recent cutting. You count rings on one. Years of growth reduced in an afternoon. The image is almost unfair. A tree may spend decades becoming useful timber. A household can burn a portion of it in days. Regrowth moves at the pace of seasons. Consumption moves at the pace of hunger. You walk back toward the village as smoke begins rising from roofs. Now every plume looks different. You understand what it represents. Not simply warmth, land, labour, trees, time. At one cottage, somebody repairs a broken stool. At another, a woman feeds kindling into an oven. Farther away, a smith's work sends faint sparks into the dim air. Each task seems tiny. Together they explain the thinning woods better than any single disaster ever could. The village has not lost its fuel because one careless person cut one tree too many. It has spent the woodland gradually, meal by meal, fence by fence, beam by beam, field by field, fire by fire, and the forest, patient but not magical, has finally begun growing back more slowly than people are asking it to disappear. You wake with your nose cold, not pleasantly cool, cold, the sort of cold that makes you remain perfectly still beneath your blanket because movement would require exposing an elbow, and the elbow has done nothing to deserve that. The room is dim. A grey square of morning light appears near the shutter. The hearth contains ash, a few dull coals, and almost no warmth. Your breath hangs faintly in the air. This is the moment when fuel scarcity stops being a distant problem of trees and becomes a problem of bodies. You pull on clothing that's not completely dry. The wool feels rough against your skin. Your fingers move slowly. Someone else in the household is already crouching at the hearth, trying to persuade yesterday's embers to become today's fire without wasting kindling. A little dry material is placed over the coals. A breath. Another breath. A faint orange glow. Everyone watches. There is something slightly humiliating about 6 people silently cheering for a twig. But medieval winter removes many unnecessary standards. The fire catches, barely. Nobody piles on logs. Instead, the household begins treating heat like treasure. The first response is simple. You make smaller fires. A large cheerful blaze looks wonderful, but it consumes fuel quickly. A low-controlled fire can keep a pot warm and take some of the bite out of the room without swallowing the remaining woodpile in an afternoon. You learn to sit closer, much closer. Benches shift toward the hearth. Stools migrate inward. Children compete for the warmest position with the ruthless precision of court politicians. The dog, displaying excellent strategic judgment, gets there first. The house changes shape around the fire. Activities that might once have spread across the room begin clustering near the warm centre. Mending happens beside the hearth. Small tools are repaired there. People prepare food there. Conversation takes place there. Someone combs wool there. Someone else dozes. The outer edges of the room become less useful as the cold deepens. You discover that medieval domestic space is not heated evenly. There is no thermostat quietly bringing every corner to the same comfortable temperature. Heat radiates from the hearth and then weakens rapidly with distance. Drafts enter through doors, shutters, walls, roof gaps, and every architectural feature that seems personally offended by warmth. Move 5 steps away and the season changes. This affects sleeping. Your household begins rearranging where people rest. Beds and pallets closer to the hearth become more desirable. People who normally sleep in separate corners may sleep nearer one another. Privacy loses a competition with temperature. You add blankets where you have them. Wool is particularly valuable because it retains warmth well, even when conditions are damp. Medieval households may use woolen blankets, cloaks, skins, straw mattresses, curtains, and layered clothing to conserve body heat. The principle is obvious. If you cannot heat the room efficiently, heat the person. You wear more clothing indoors. A cloak that once belongs outside becomes normal beside the table. Caps remain on heads. Children sleep in garments. You may even use clothing as bedding if blankets are scarce. The richer households have advantages here. They can possess more textiles, heavier coverings, enclosed bed curtains, larger reserves of fuel, and servants who have the enviable privilege of getting up first to deal with the freezing hearth. Used naturally are not rich enough to outsource dawn, so you pull your cloak tighter. The family begins closing spaces that do not need to stay open. A door between rooms remains shut. Shutters close earlier. Cloths may be hung where they reduce drafts. Beds can be positioned away from the coldest walls. The goal is not to create modern comfort. The goal is to stop warmth escaping quite so enthusiastically. Even animals may become part of the household heat strategy. In some medieval rural buildings, people and livestock occupy spaces connected under the same roof or within closely joined structures. Animals produce heat, and their presence can make adjacent areas less bitterly cold. You're not sleeping romantically beside a cow because someone wrote a pastoral poem about rustic harmony. The cow is basically a very large biological radiator with opinions. Of course, this arrangement brings smells, strong smells. Warmth has a price. You decide not to investigate the price too closely. By midday, the household faces another problem: wet clothing. Winter work still continues. You must go outside. Fields require attention. Animals need feeding. Water must be fetched. Repairs do not care about your comfort. When you return, your shoes are damp and your hem is muddy. Normally, the hearth helps dry everything, but drying clothing consumes heat indirectly. If garments are spread near the fire, you need the fire burning long enough to do the job. Now you hang items more carefully, you rotate them, you avoid getting them too close because scorched wool smells terrible, and turning your only winter cloak into a smoking decoration would be a poor survival decision. Dampness becomes as threatening as cold. Cold air is uncomfortable. Cold, wet fabric pressed against the body is worse. You begin planning movements around weather. If rain falls heavily, perhaps a non-essential trip can wait. If you can perform several chores in one journey, or you do. If a child can carry water and return with animal feed, excellent. The household becomes an exercise in energy conservation, both human and combustible. The fire is not the only thing you ration. You ration effort. The old, the sick, infants, and very young children are especially vulnerable. A healthy adult can shiver, move, work, and produce body heat. Someone weakened by illness may struggle. An elderly person may not tolerate prolonged cold well. An infant cannot simply put on another cloak and complain about management. This means the warmest places in the house become moral decisions. Who sits closest? Who receives the better blanket? Who gets the warm broth? No village rule automatically answers these questions. Households negotiate them through affection, hierarchy, necessity, and sometimes irritation. The grandmother gets the warm bench, the toddler gets the lap. The teenager who claimed to be freezing 5 minutes ago is sent to fetch water. An ancient system of thermal justice has been restored. At night, several people may share a bed or sleeping platform. Modern ideas about personal sleeping space would seem extravagant. Sharing body warmth makes practical sense. Bed curtains, where available, help trap warmer air. Straw beneath you provides insulation. Blankets pile above. Clothing may remain on if you are wealthy enough to possess a feather mattress. Congratulations. If not, the straw has not filed a complaint. You lie close to another person and listen to the room cool. The hearth has been deliberately reduced. Keeping a full fire all night would consume precious fuel and create risks. Open flames in timber and thatch buildings are not a small matter. Fire is useful, but it has no loyalty. One overturned ember can destroy a house. A stronger blaze can spread into neighbouring roofs. So households must balance cold against fire danger. A low bed of embers becomes preferable to an unattended roaring flame. This is a mainstream reality of medieval domestic life. Most ordinary homes are not maintained at anything close to modern indoor temperatures during winter. Heating is localised, often centred on a hearth, stove, or brazier depending on region and period, and people rely heavily on clothing, bedding, architecture, and shared warmth. You begin to understand why medieval clothing can look excessive to modern eyes. Layers are technology. A linen undergarment helps against the skin. Wool traps warmth. A hood protects the head and neck. A cloak creates another barrier. Mittens or gloves matter during outside work. Clothing is not merely fashion. It is insulation that walks. There is also a curious domestic trick found in various pre-modern settings. Warmed stones, bricks, or other heat-retaining objects can sometimes be wrapped or placed near bedding to provide temporary warmth. You do not toss a glowing rock casually under the blanket unless you wish to invent medieval smoke detection. The object must be handled sensibly, but the idea is attractive. Heat something while the fire is already being used, then carry that stored warmth elsewhere. A warming pan serves a similar purpose in wealthier households in later periods. But even simple heated objects reveal the same principle. When fuel is scarce, you use the heat more than once. You also begin spending less time alone. That change is easy to miss. A cold house encourages clustering. Relatives visit one another selectively. Neighbours may gather where a fire is already burning rather than lighting another one elsewhere. Several tasks can be done in the same warm space. One hearth supports many bodies. You notice how conversation changes. People stay seated longer, stories stretch, work that can be done by hand moves indoors, spinning, sewing, repairing, shelling, sorting, and small craft tasks become easier to combine with communal warmth. You are conserving fuel, but you're also reshaping social life. The fire becomes a magnet. This does not mean everyone becomes charming. Crowding produces its own problems. Someone coughs, someone snores, someone complains about the smell, a child kicks your shin, an uncle begins telling the same story for the 5th time. You consider walking into the snow voluntarily. Then a draft enters beneath the door and family suddenly seems wonderful again. Historians still argue whether ordinary medieval peasants in colder regions routinely experienced indoor temperatures that modern observers would consider dangerously low, because surviving evidence rarely records household temperatures directly, and conditions vary widely by building type, wealth, climate, and fuel availability. Archaeology helps. Building remains help. Accounts of fuel purchases help. Descriptions of clothing and bedding help. Yet nobody leaves you a neat chart saying, Tuesday morning, bedroom unpleasant, toes deeply disappointed. You have to reconstruct the experience from fragments. Your own body needs no chart. As evening comes, you can feel the cottage losing heat. The daylight fades. The outer wall seems colder. The floor feels harder beneath your feet. The air near the hearth remains bearable. 2 paces away, less so. You eat close together. The meal is hot. But the heat from the bowl matters nearly as much as the taste. You wrap both hands around it. Steam touches your face. For a moment, the warmth feels almost luxurious. Then the bowl empties. Someone adds 1 small piece of wood to the fire, not 2. 1. The household becomes quiet as flame takes hold. You realize something strange. Scarcity makes you notice warmth itself. Ordinarily, comfort disappears into the background. Now every warm object has significance. A heated bowl, a wool blanket, another person's shoulder, sunlight through an opening, a patch of floor warmed by an animal, a coal that survives the night. You stop expecting the whole house to be comfortable. You begin searching for small islands of warmth. This changes behavior almost immediately. You rise later if darkness and cold make early work inefficient. You finish outdoor tasks before evening when possible. You gather people into fewer rooms as you sleep closer, you wear more, you waste less heat. Your world contracts toward warm surfaces and sheltered corners. Outside, frost settles over the roofs. Inside, the fire lowers itself into red embers. Nobody feeds it. You crawl beneath layers of wool and straw. Another body settles nearby. The dog circles twice and occupies exactly the spot everyone secretly wanted. You pull your cloak over your chest. The room is still cold. The roof still leaks tiny draughts. Your nose may remain offended until morning, but the household has begun learning a new kind of winter discipline. Not how to make the house warm. How to live inside a house that is not. You leave the houses with a rope, a small axe, and the kind of optimism usually associated with people who have not yet met medieval property law. The nearby ground has been searched thoroughly. Fallen branches disappear almost as soon as they appear. So you walk toward land used in common by villagers, hoping to find something that can still be carried home without starting an argument. The word common sounds wonderfully simple. It is not. A medieval common is not necessarily land where absolutely everyone may do absolutely anything. Rights can be carefully defined by custom. One household may graze animals there, another may gather certain kinds of fuel, someone may cut turf, someone else may collect bracken. The land may belong legally to a lord while villagers possess customary rights to use particular resources. You therefore enter the landscape carrying 2 invisible things, need and permission. Unfortunately, they do not always travel together. You reach a rough area of scrub beyond the cultivated fields. Thorn bushes spread between patches of grass. Small trees twist toward the pale sky. At first, it looks promising. You spot dead branches tangled in a hedge. You begin pulling them free. This kind of material matters enormously. Twigs, brush, dead branches, and hedge trimmings may not create magnificent fires, but they ignite easily and can supplement larger pieces of fuel. A bundle becomes useful precisely because you can collect it without felling a mature tree. You snap several dry sticks. Then you notice another villager watching you. Not threateningly, just carefully. You recognize the expression. It says, "I am also freezing, and I have counted those sticks." Resource scarcity makes people observant. You nod. The other villager nods. Diplomacy succeeds. For now. You move farther along the hedge. Hedges themselves are valuable structures. They mark boundaries, guide animals, protect crops, and provide wood when managed properly. But cutting too aggressively can damage them. A hedge strip for fuel today may fail as a barrier tomorrow. Then livestock wander into crops. Then people shout. Then somebody blames somebody's pig. Medieval rural administration could probably function for an entire year using only the phrase whose pig was that. So your gathering is constrained. Take dead material. Avoid ruining living growth. Do not damage the boundary. Do not cut what custom forbids. Do not annoy the person who believes the hedge belongs more to them than to you. Easy. You continue toward a woodland attached to the manor. Here the trees are larger. Your eyes immediately rise toward branches that could warm a household for days, but you cannot simply cut them. Woodland rites are often divided into categories that seem almost designed to torment hungry and cold people. Villagers may have customary rites called estovas in some parts of medieval England. Estovas can include rites to take certain wood for necessities such as fuel, fencing, or repairs, depending on local custom. These rites are not an unlimited invitation to fell whatever looks flammable. They are bounded. You may be entitled to dead wood. You may be permitted certain branches. You may be allowed specified quantities. You may need the Lord's permission for larger timber, and the exact rules can differ dramatically between communities. This is a mainstream fact of medieval rural life. Common rights and customary access to natural resources are often central to peasant survival. The landscape is divided not merely by fences but by layers of legal expectation. You step beneath an oak, a fallen branch lies ahead. Perfect. Then you stop. Is it fallen naturally? Was it cut? Does that matter? Who has the right to remove it? Would anyone notice? Of course someone would notice. Medieval villages are small enough that privacy is mostly a decorative concept. You bend and inspect the branch. It is old, weathered, and clearly detached. You drag it away. Your shoulders immediately inform you that medieval law has granted you access, but medieval physics remains hostile. The branch catches on a root. You pull, it catches again. You pull harder. A smaller twig whips backward and hits your sleeve. The woodland has now issued its own fine. Eventually you reach an open path. Your bundle grows. So does the risk of somebody asking questions. Officials connected with the manor or forest administration can monitor woodland use. Depending on place and period, foresters, woodwards, reeves, or other local officers may be responsible for protecting valuable trees, enforcing rules, or reporting unauthorized cutting. A lord has good reasons to care. Timber is wealth. Woodland can support animals. It may provide hunting. It can generate rents and fees. A tree cut secretly for household fuel may represent lost income. To you, it is warmth. To the estate, it may be theft. This conflict becomes sharper when fuel is scarce. Customary rights that once seem adequate begin feeling painfully narrow. You need more. The rules do not expand merely because the temperature drops, so villagers test boundaries. A woman gathers slightly beyond the usual area. A man cuts a branch rather than waiting for one to fall. Children are sent to collect sticks where adults might attract attention. Someone enters woodland at dusk. Someone insists that a disputed patch has always been used by their family. Someone else insists it absolutely has not. Memory becomes a legal instrument. Conveniently flexible memory becomes an even better one. You hear an axe deeper among the trees. One strike, then another. You cannot see who is cutting. The sound stops when voices approach. That tells you enough. Unauthorized woodcutting can produce fines. Manorial court records from medieval England and other documentary traditions preserve disputes involving woodland, hedges, grazing, trespass, and the taking of resources. The offences can appear small: a few branches, a damaged hedge, wood taken without permission, yet repeated across a community. These small acts reveal how intensely people depend on access to land. You leave the path and search beneath trees. Most of the easy deadwood is gone. Then you find a cluster of fallen limbs covered with a moss. Too wet. You turn one over. Beetles scatter beneath it. A small creature appears so personally offended by your investigation that you apologize to it. You consider carrying the branch anyway. Wet wood burned badly, smokes heavily, and wastes effort. You leave it. Farther uphill lies church land. The church is another landholder in medieval society. Monasteries, parish institutions, bishops, and other ecclesiastical bodies can possess woods, fields, and estates. A villager may therefore live in a world where one patch belongs to a secular lord, another to a monastery, another falls under customary common use, and another is fiercely disputed by everyone with enough confidence to point at a boundary stone. Sacred ownership does not make the trees warmer. It simply changes who may object when you cut them. You pass near a churchyard wall where small fallen branches have collected, tempting. But people notice what is removed from church property too. You take nothing, not because your conscience suddenly achieves sainthood, because the priest knows your mother. That is stronger. As the day progresses, you meet others carrying bundles. One household has gathered thorny brush, another has found dead branches near grazing land. An elderly man carries surprisingly little, and complains that younger villagers take everything before sunrise. A child drags a branch twice their own height. The branch wins most of the journey. You begin to see how scarcity creates a race. Whoever reaches accessible deadwood first gets it. The strong can travel farther. Households with carts can bring back heavier loads. Families with more working adults can send gatherers more often. The poor may possess customary rights yet lack the labour or transport to benefit from them fully. The elderly may struggle. Widows with limited household labour can be especially vulnerable. Rights on parchment or in custom do not guarantee equal access in practice. Historians still argue whether common rights in medieval villages generally acted as a powerful protection for poorer households, or whether local hierarchies often allowed wealthier peasants to capture a disproportionate share of common resources. Both patterns can appear. Communities vary. Custom can protect. Custom can also be manipulated. You see the tension in small gestures. A villager guards a pile while another person fetches rope. Someone accuses someone else of taking wood from the wrong side of a ditch. A man points toward a boundary that is apparently obvious to everyone except the three people currently arguing about it. The ditch becomes a courtroom. No judge is present. That does not reduce the volume. You walk away. There are wiser ways to spend a cold afternoon than becoming an expert witness in the case of the suspicious stick. Toward dusk, you reach a neglected patch of scrub near the edge of pasture. Here you find something useful. A dead branch, then another, then a tangle of dry thorn. You work carefully. The thorns catch your sleeves and prick your fingers. You bind the material into a bundle. It is ugly fuel, but it is fuel. You lift it onto your back. The weight settles across your shoulders. Walking home becomes slow. Every step makes the bundle shift. Twigs poke your neck. One catches in your hair. You now resemble a mobile hedge. Still, the sight of smoke above the cottages pulls you onward. Other villagers emerge from different paths carrying their own collections. You notice immediately who has done well. Large bundles attract glances. A man with a cart attracts even more. Nobody asks too many questions. That silence is meaningful. Some fuel may be perfectly legitimate. Some may come from generous interpretation of custom. Some may have changed ownership during a mysterious encounter with darkness. A community under pressure develops a complicated relationship with rules. People still value order. They also value warm children. When the two conflict, obedience becomes negotiable. You reach the edge of the village. Your hands ache. Your back hurts. You have spent most of a day searching for material that may burn for only a short time. That ratio is terrifying. Hours of labour become hours of heat. The equation no longer feels sustainable. You lower the bundle beside the house, dry sticks clatter onto the ground. Someone comes to inspect your haul. No celebration follows. Everyone understands what it cost. Distance, time, risk, fatigue. The woodland has not vanished, but easy access has vanished. and that distinction turns every remaining branch into something more than fuel. It becomes property, custom, privilege, temptation, evidence. You look toward the darkening line of trees. Tomorrow, other feet will travel those same paths. Other hands will search the same hedges. Every useful stick will be noticed. Every boundary will matter. Every old right will suddenly feel smaller. And in a village where warmth depends on what the landscape allows you to carry away, even a fallen branch can become political. You begin looking at ordinary objects differently. A broken stool is no longer merely broken, it is potential heat. A worn fence post looks suspiciously useful. A bundle of dried weeds suddenly possesses the glamour of treasure. Once proper firewood becomes difficult to obtain, your idea of what counts as fuel expands with impressive speed. The hearth does not care about dignity. It cares whether something burns. You start with brushwood, thin branches, thorn cuttings, twigs, and scrub can all feed a fire. They're easy to ignite, especially when dry, but they burn quickly. A bundle that takes an hour to gather can vanish with insulting efficiency. You crouch beside the hearth and push in a handful. Flames leap up. For several glorious minutes the room looks cheerful. Then the brush collapses into ash. Excellent. You have invented 5 minutes of optimism, so you experiment. The village landscape contains more combustible material than you once noticed. After harvest, fields may leave straw, stalks, husks, and other plant waste. Some of this material already has important uses. Straw can become bedding, roofing material, animal litter, fodder in certain circumstances, or mixed into building materials. That means burning it creates another competition. If you feed straw to the fire, you cannot put the same straw beneath an animal. If you burn useful stalks, you lose whatever other purpose they might serve. Scarcity rarely gives you a clean solution. It offers trades. You collect a handful of dry straw and twist it into a rough bundle. It catches almost immediately. The flame burns bright, restless, and fast. Smoke curls upward. The straw disappears. You add more. Again. Warmth. Again. Nothing. The household begins mixing fuels. A small piece of wood goes in first, then brush, then straw, then another piece of wood. The aim is to stretch every proper log by surrounding it with lesser materials. You learn how different fuels behave. Some flare, some smoulder, some produce more smoke than heat. Some smell so unpleasant that you briefly reconsider whether freezing has been unfairly criticized. People across pre-industrial societies routinely use locally available biomass when wood is scarce. This can include crop residues, reeds, heather, bracken, turf, peat, dried dung, and many other materials depending on geography. That is the mainstream reality. Medieval fuel use is not simply a story of logs. It is a story of whatever the local environment can surrender. In a wet lowland area, reeds may matter. On open moorland, heather can become useful. In places with peat deposits, people may cut peat from boggy ground. Where livestock are abundant and wood is scarce, dried animal dung can become fuel. You hear that last possibility and glance toward the cattle. The cattle remain emotionally unavailable. Dung seems an unlikely source of comfort until you dry it. Fresh manure contains too much moisture to burn well, but when shaped, dried, and stored properly, it becomes combustible. This practice is widespread in many parts of the world historically, especially in regions where timber is limited. You gather some only because necessity has already defeated pride. The process is not elegant. You spread or shape the material and allow sun and air to remove moisture. When properly dry, it can burn steadily enough to provide useful heat. The smell is less dramatic than your imagination predicts if the fuel is dried thoroughly, though nobody's confusing the experience with scented candles. You place a piece near the fire. It catches slowly. The household watches. Someone wrinkles their nose. Someone else points out that warmth has no perfume requirement. This is how standards evolve. Yesterday, a pile of dung near the house is a chore. Today, it is an energy reserve. Tomorrow, someone will probably accuse a cow of underproduction. Different animals produce different kinds of waste, and the availability of dung fuel depends heavily on local farming patterns. Cattle, sheep, horses, and other livestock all turn plant material into something that can eventually return a portion of its stored energy through burning. But manure also has agricultural value. Spread on fields, it improves soil fertility. Burn it, and you lose much of that benefit. Once again, heat today competes against another need. You stand in a yard staring at a pile of manure and realize you're making decisions that somehow involve both winter survival and next season's crops. Medieval economists can be extremely earthy. Then someone mentions peat. The village has access to wet ground where dark, partially decayed plant material lies beneath the surface. Peat forms slowly where waterlogged conditions prevent vegetation from decomposing completely. Cut into blocks and dried, it can burn. You travel to the bog with a spade. The ground gives slightly beneath your feet. Water glistens in shallow hollows. You cut into the dark material. Peat's heavier when wet than you expect. Of course it is. Everything medieval becomes heavier the moment you have to carry it. The blocks must dry before they become useful fuel. That requires time, weather, and space. You stack them so air can circulate. If rain continues, drying becomes difficult. If the peat remains wet, it smokes and burns poorly. But once prepared, it can become an important substitute for wood. In certain parts of medieval and later Europe, peat develops into a major domestic fuel, especially where accessible woodland is limited and peatlands are abundant. It burns differently from seasoned wood. The smell can be distinctive. The smoke can be heavy. The ash behaves differently. Yet a household desperate for warmth learns quickly not to demand elegance from geology. You begin noticing turf as well. In some places, people cut pieces of vegetation and soil, dry them, and burn them. This works better under certain environmental conditions than others. Again, local landscapes decide what is possible. A village near woodland has one energy system. A village near peat bogs has another. A treeless coastal community may rely more heavily on driftwood, turf, seaweed, or imported fuel. There is no single medieval fuel basket. There is improvisation. One afternoon, you find an old wooden chest with a split side. It has already been repaired twice. The hinges are damaged. The lid no longer closes. Someone suggests fixing it again. Someone else looks toward the hearth. Silence. The chest is suddenly participating in a very short philosophical discussion about purpose. You remove the iron fittings. The wood is dry. It burns beautifully. That creates a strange hierarchy among possessions. Anything wooden must now justify remaining an object. A stool with 3 legs becomes vulnerable. A broken rake handle becomes vulnerable. A cracked bowl may become vulnerable if it is wooden. Old shutters, spare boards, damaged carts, useless baskets, discarded tool handles, and construction scraps all invite inspection. You do not burn essential items casually. Replacing them requires labour and materials. But objects beyond repair can have one final use. They become heat. A household therefore squeezes value from wood twice. First as an object, then as fuel. Even ashes are useful. Wood ash can have several household and agricultural applications. It may contribute to soap making, cleaning processes, soil amendment, or other tasks depending on local practice. The fire leaves waste, but medieval households have little enthusiasm for waste remaining useless. You scoop cooled ash into a container. Nothing glamorous happens, nobody applauds. Still, the material stays in circulation. One quirky fuel source appears along coastlines. Dried seaweed can sometimes be burned. It is smoky, salty, and not necessarily pleasant, but coastal communities in treeless or wood-poor environments historically learn to exploit what the shore provides. Imagine walking onto a beach and thinking, yes, perhaps the ocean has brought dinner's heating system. You do exactly that if circumstances demand it. Driftwood is even more attractive. Branches and timber carried by rivers or sea can become valuable fuel. A piece washed ashore belongs to nobody, unless local custom immediately discovers that it belongs to somebody. Naturally, you drag waterlogged wood above the high tide line and leave it to dry. Months ago you would have walked past. Now you examine every piece like an appraiser. The village also begins collecting chips and shavings from craftsmen more carefully. A carpenter's floor becomes interesting. Sawdust, curled shavings, broken pegs, bark, and small scraps can help start fires. Bark itself may burn when dry. Pine cones burn, nutshells burn, dried weeds burn. Almost anything made from plant material contains stored energy. The question is whether obtaining, drying, and burning it produces enough useful heat to justify the effort. That is where desperation becomes inefficient. You can spend enormous amounts of labour gathering fuels that vanish quickly. A child can collect twigs for hours. A fire can consume them during one meal. You begin measuring fuel not just by quantity but by labour. A heavy basket of damp weeds may be worthless. A small armful of dense dry material may be precious. Knowledge becomes increasingly practical. You learn what catches easily, what lasts, what smokes, what sparks, what leaves too much ash, what makes the cooking pot taste strange, what must never be burned indoors. Painted or chemically treated timber is not a medieval concern in the modern sense, but some materials can still release unpleasant fumes, and smoke from any poor fire is already hazardous. Indoor air in pre-modern houses can be extremely smoky, especially where hearth design and ventilation are limited. Alternative fuels can make this worse. Peat smoke lingers, damp biomass smoulders, dung produces its own odour, straw throws sparks, your eyes water, your throat becomes irritated, the rafters darken from soot. You cough into your sleeve and begin to suspect that warmth is conducting a personal attack. Historians still argue whether fuel substitution in wood-scarce medieval communities usually prevented genuine domestic energy crises, or merely softened them by replacing good fuel with lower quality materials that demanded more labour and created other costs. The answer depends greatly on location. A community with rich peat deposits may adapt effectively. A household surrounded by livestock may have access to dung. A coastal settlement may use drift materials. Another village may have few alternatives worth gathering. Substitution helps most when the alternative is abundant, nearby, and easy to prepare. Otherwise, you're simply spending half the day searching for things that burn badly. Even fuel quality affects social status. A wealthy household can purchase or reserve seasoned hardwood. A poorer one may burn whatever can be collected. The difference appears in smoke, labour, cooking time, and comfort. One hearth glows steadily, another spits, smoulders, and fills the room with enough haze to make everyone look mysterious. You sit beside a mixed fire built from one proper log, a few sticks, dried plant material, and a piece of peat. It is not beautiful. The flame rises unevenly. Smoke escapes poorly for a moment. You shift the fuel with a stick. The peat begins glowing. The log catches. Warmth spreads over your hands. You feel something close to triumph. Not because you have solved the village's problem, because you have discovered that scarcity does not immediately mean surrender. People improvise. They adapt. They inspect materials that once seemed worthless. Fields, bogs, barns, beaches, workshops, hedges, and rubbish piles all begin contributing tiny pieces to the same goal. Keep the hearth alive. The village now smells different, less like clean wood smoke, more complicated, more agricultural, more damp, more inventive. You walk through the evening and see faint smoke rising from several houses. Each chimney or roof opening tells a different story. Wood here, peat there, brush somewhere else, perhaps dung behind that wall, though nobody is volunteering the information. Nothing burns as conveniently as a good dry log. That fact becomes clearer every day. But convenience has left the village, necessity remains, so you bend, gather, dry, stack, carry, and burn almost anything the landscape can spare. You discover that hunger has a temperature. A handful of grain sitting in a sack may contain plenty of nourishment, but grain does not politely transform itself into supper. Beans remain stubbornly hard. Tough vegetables require time. Meat from an older animal can demand long cooking. Even water becomes a problem when every pot placed over the hearth consumes part of a limited fuel supply. So you begin thinking about food differently, not simply by asking what you have. You ask how much fire it takes. That question reshapes the kitchen. A thick pot of pottage has long been one of the practical foundations of ordinary medieval eating. Grain, peas, beans, onions, herbs, vegetables, and occasional pieces of meat can simmer together into something filling and adaptable. Under normal conditions, slow cooking is useful. Now, slow cooking looks expensive. You place a pot over a small flame and watch it begin to heat. Usually you might let it simmer for a long time, allowing tough ingredients to soften. Instead, the fire is reduced as soon as possible. A lid goes firmly onto the pot. That simple lid matters. Covered vessels lose heat more slowly and require less energy to keep food hot. Every bit of trapped steam is one less argument with the fuel supply. You also cut ingredients smaller. A large turnip takes time to soften. Thin pieces cook faster. Beans can be soaked before cooking, so they need less time over heat. Grain can be crushed or ground more finely. You begin preparing food with an eye toward reducing the work demanded from the hearth. The knife becomes part of fuel economy. Nobody sings songs about this. There is probably a reason medieval ballads contain relatively few verses celebrating efficient turnip geometry. You soak dried peas overnight. By morning they have absorbed water and softened. When they enter the pot, they cook more quickly. This is not revolutionary technology. It is patient household knowledge. Across pre-industrial societies, cooks develop countless methods for reducing fuel use, because energy is expensive in labour, even when nobody pays coins for the wood itself. Soaking, grinding, chopping, covering, preheating, using residual heat, all become important. You learn to bring a pot to a strong boil, then move it toward a cooler part of the hearth, where it can continue cooking more gently. If the vessel is well covered and sufficiently hot, food continues softening without requiring a roaring flame beneath it every moment. In some traditions, heated pots can even be wrapped or surrounded with insulating material to preserve warmth and finish cooking slowly. You're essentially convincing supper that the fire is still present. Supper, fortunately, is not very observant. The same logic changes what you choose to eat. Foods requiring hours of boiling become less attractive. Anything that can be eaten raw, lightly cooked, toasted quickly, or prepared using retained heat gains value. Cheese is wonderful. No fuel required. Bread already baked is wonderful. No fuel required at the moment you eat it. Cold-cooked meat, where available, suddenly seems highly sophisticated. Apples, nuts, certain vegetables, dried fruits, and preserved foods can provide nourishment without demanding another potful of burning wood. You find yourself staring lovingly at a piece of cheese. This is not romance. This is thermodynamics. Preservation becomes even more important. Medieval households already preserve food because harvests are seasonal and refrigeration does not exist. Salting, drying, smoking, pickling, fermenting, and storing produce in cool conditions can all extend usefulness depending on the food and local resources. Fuel scarcity adds another advantage. Preserved food may reduce cooking needs. Salted meat might still require preparation, but it does not have to be cooked immediately after slaughter. Dried foods can be stored. Cheese converts perishable milk into a compact food that can last much longer. Butter may be stored for a time. Fermented products provide calories while shifting some of the transformation away from direct heat. You begin appreciating every method that makes microbes, salt, air, or time perform work that fire would otherwise need to do. The kitchen starts resembling a negotiation between biology and winter. One major problem remains bread. Bread is too important simply to abandon. In many medieval communities, grain provides a substantial portion of daily calories. Wheat bread may be preferred where wheat grows well and households can afford it, while rye, barley, oats, mixed grains, and other cereals matter enormously depending on region and status. But baking requires considerable heat. Heating a large oven for a single small loaf would be ridiculous. So efficiency favours concentration. Several loaves can be baked together. A household may use a communal oven, a lord's oven where local obligations require it, or some shared baking arrangement depending on place and period. You arrive carrying dough. Other households are already present. The oven has been heated intensely. Wood burns inside until the masonry absorbs enough heat. The embers are then managed or removed according to the oven design, and bread goes into the hot chamber. Now the stored heat does the work. One firing can bake many loaves. That is the crucial advantage. You are pooling energy. A communal oven turns a social obligation into something that also makes physical sense when fuel is limited. Of course, communal systems create communal irritations. Whose loaf goes where? Whose dough is ready? Who arrived late? Who took the loaf with the nicer crust within minutes? Civilization has progressed from energy efficiency to bread litigation. Still, the savings matter. The oven retains heat after the main bread comes out. Nobody wants to waste that warmth. Other foods can follow. Pies, small dishes to perhaps fruit for drying. Foods requiring gentler heat. Residual warmth becomes a second cooking session, then perhaps a third. This practice of using an oven's declining heat for multiple purposes is a sensible feature of fuel-conscious cooking. The hottest stage performs the hardest task. Later stages handle foods needing less heat. Even the cooling masonry remains valuable for a while. You become almost offended by unused warmth. Brewing creates another challenge. Ale is a significant part of diet in many medieval communities, though strength, quality, ingredients, and consumption vary widely. Brewing typically involves heating water and processing grain, which means fuel. When wood grows costly, brewing cannot proceed casually. Households may brew less often in larger batches. Specialist or commercial brewers can become more important in some settlements. Sharing equipment and concentrating production can reduce duplicated heating. The same principle keeps returning. One fire doing several jobs is better than several fires doing one job each. You begin arranging household work around that idea. If water must be heated for cooking, perhaps some can also be used for washing if the oven is hot. Bake everything ready to bake. If a pot has finished cooking, place another vessel where the remaining heat can warm it. If embers remain, toast grain or dry something near them. A fire is never simply a fire anymore. It is a schedule. Someone begins timing chores around it with such precision that the household appears to have accidentally invented project management. Then there is meat. Large joints demand time. Small pieces cook faster. Stews make tough cuts tender, but stewing requires prolonged heat. Roasting near an open fire can also consume plenty of fuel, especially if a large fire must be maintained. So large pieces become less convenient. Chopping meat into smaller portions reduces cooking time. Using already hot liquid helps. Combining small quantities with grain or vegetables stretches both food and fuel. This does not mean every household suddenly abandons traditional dishes. People preserve preferences stubbornly. Food is culture as much as nutrition. But pressure shifts habits. You notice the wealthier table can resist these changes longer. A prosperous household can purchase fuel. It can employ servants to obtain it. It can keep larger fires. It may roast more frequently or support elaborate cooking techniques. Your household has fewer options. Energy inequality appears on the plate. The rich can afford foods that require more heat to prepare. The poor increasingly choose foods partly because they are cheap to cook. This is a mainstream historical principle that extends far beyond the Middle Ages. Fuel cost shapes diet. Food's not economically expensive only because of their ingredients. Preparation can carry a substantial hidden cost. The fuel bill is measured in coins if you buy wood. It is measured in hours if you gather it. Either way, somebody pays. You also discover that certain vessels become more desirable. A pot that transfers heat efficiently matters. A vessel with a well-fitting lid matters. An oven that stores heat in masonry matters. Equipment that reduces waste becomes valuable, even if nobody describes the process in scientific language. Experience teaches what works. A cook knows where the hottest part of the hearth is. A baker knows how the oven changes as it cools. A brewer knows when heat is sufficient. These skills are forms of energy management. They live in hands and habits. One quirky practice found in later European household traditions, with older roots in fuel-saving logic, involves bringing a pot to heat and then insulating it inside cloth, straw, or another material so cooking continues without constant fire. The exact forms and documentation vary by place and period, but the principle is wonderfully simple. Heat the food, trap the heat, stop feeding the flame. Now you try something similar with a covered pot nestled carefully near insulating material and spend the next hour checking it so often that any theoretical labour saving disappears. Eventually you trust it. The food continues softening. You feel absurdly pleased. Historians still argue whether periods of serious fuel scarcity significantly changed ordinary medieval diets on a broad regional scale, or whether households usually adjusted cooking methods while preserving their basic food patterns. Evidence is uneven. Recipes tell you more about literate and often wealthier households than about the poorest cottages. Accounts can reveal purchases. Archaeology reveals vessels, ovens, hearths, and food remains. Yet the daily decision to cut a turnip thinner because wood is scarce rarely leaves a document. That decision disappears into dinner, but you can feel how naturally it happens. By evening, the household meal looks modest. Bread, a thick mixture of grain and legumes, a little cheese, some preserved food. The pot has cooked with less fuel than it once would have. Nothing feels luxurious. Nothing needs to. The important thing is that everyone eats. You notice how carefully the remaining heat is used. A smaller vessel warms near the embers. Damp herbs hang nearby to dry. A piece of bread is toasted at the edge. Someone sets water where it will slowly become warm enough for another task. The hearth has become too valuable to perform only one service at a time. You sit with your bowl in both hands. Its warmth seeps into your fingers. The food tastes slightly different because ingredients have been prepared differently. Smaller pieces, longer soaking, less prolonged boiling, more preserved additions. You chew slowly. Hunger makes an excellent seasoning. Across the room, dough waits for the next shared bake-in. A covered pot retains its heat. Cheese rests on a wooden board, requiring absolutely nothing from the fire and therefore enjoying enormous popularity. You realize that a shortage of wood can reach farther than the woodland, farther than the hearth, farther even than the walls of the cottage. It enters the cooking pot. It changes the size of the pieces. It changes the timing of meals. It changes what gets boiled, what gets baked, what gets preserved, and what gets eaten cold. Every mouthful now contains an invisible ingredient, the cost of heat. You know trouble has arrived when two respectable adults begin shouting over a branch. Not a tree, Not a cartload of timber. One branch. It lies across the edge of a muddy lane, half stripped of bark, crooked enough to be useless for building and just dry enough to make perfectly decent fuel. You reach it at almost the same moment as your neighbour. Your hand touches one end, his hand touches the other. Both of you pause. There are many elegant moments in human history, Chris. This is not one of them. He says he saw it first. You say you picked it up first. He says it fell from his hedge. You point out that it is lying in the road. He says the road runs beside his holding. You say roads do not traditionally grow branches. For several seconds, neither of you lets go. A child watches from a doorway with the delighted expression of someone who has unexpectedly received free entertainment. Eventually you surrender the branch, not because your neighbour has proved ownership, because spending half the morning fighting over 6 pounds of wood is beginning to seem like a poor use of calories. Still, resentment follows you home. This is what prolonged scarcity does to village relationships. Objects that once seemed trivial acquire value, and once they have value, people begin remembering exactly who touched them, cut them, carried them, promised them, borrowed them, or allegedly stole them. The village becomes unusually attentive. A missing bundle is noticed immediately. A hedge cut too deeply attracts suspicion. A fresh stump produces questions. Wood chips found beside a doorway can suddenly look like evidence. Nobody needs a detective. Everyone is already watching everyone else. Suppose you leave a small stack beside your house overnight. In the morning, 2 pieces are gone. Perhaps someone in the household used them. Perhaps they rolled away. Perhaps a neighbour borrowed them. Perhaps a passing saint required kindling. You do not really believe the saint theory. You start asking questions. That alone causes trouble. Accusing someone of theft threatens more than a single relationship. Medieval rural life depends heavily on cooperation. Neighbours help with harvests. They lend tools. They share information. They witness agreements. They watch animals. They may stand together in court. They exchange labour. A quarrel over wood can therefore spread into every corner of village life. You accuse a man of stealing branches. He denies it. Next week you need help repairing a roof. Remarkably, he has become very busy. Social memory is long. The village may lack paper for every tiny transaction, but it possesses something almost as durable. Grudges. One afternoon, shouting erupts near a boundary hedge. You follow the noise. A woman stands with both hands on her hips, while another household servant holds a billhook. Several freshly cut branches lie on the ground. The dispute is obvious. The woman claims the hedge belongs to her tenancy and has been damaged. The servant insists he was cutting only dead growth. She points to bright pale wood exposed where living branches have clearly been severed. The servant develops sudden interest in the weather. Boundary hedges are especially dangerous sources of conflict because they do several jobs at once. They mark property. They contain animals. They shelter fields. They produce useful sticks. Cutting them can therefore look like maintenance to one person and theft to another. The argument quickly attracts spectators. Nobody admits to being interested. Everyone remains. Village entertainment has arrived, and admission is free. Someone claims the boundary actually lies several feet farther east. Someone else remembers an old marker stone. A third person says the stone was moved years ago. A fourth asks who moved it. Nobody knows. The argument has now achieved full medieval maturity. Disputes like these can reach manorial courts in many parts of medieval Europe, especially where documentary records survive well. Local courts deal with small-scale offences involving trespass, damaged crops, unauthorised grazing, broken boundaries, and unlawful taking of wood. This is a mainstream historical fact. The court is not concerned only with dramatic crime. It spends a great deal of time dealing with ordinary friction. Your village might present complaints before the Lord's officials or a local court gathering. Neighbours testify. Offences are described. Fines may be imposed. Custom is recalled. The process can feel surprisingly formal given that the original problem may involve a few cut sticks. You attend one such gathering. People stand waiting while cases are called. A man is accused of taking wood without permission. He insists it was dead wood. Another villager claims the branch was still attached. Now everyone must decide exactly how attached a branch needs to be before it stops being legally alive. You begin to appreciate why officials age badly. Another case concerns a damaged hedge. Another involves animals entering land through the damaged section. Suddenly, one unauthorized cut has created two offenses. The missing branches became fuel. The gap let livestock through. The livestock damaged crops. The crop owner wants compensation. One small act has developed administrative descendants. Fines matter because coin can be scarce. A modest penalty that looks insignificant to a wealthy landholder may hurt a poor household badly. The person fined for taking wood might have taken it precisely because purchasing fuel was already difficult. Punishment, therefore, does not remove the need. It simply adds another burden. Some offenders repeat the behaviour. Court records sometimes show individuals fined again and again for similar offences. That can reflect stubbornness. It can reflect weak enforcement. It can also reflect necessity. If the choice is between obeying a woodland restriction and keeping a household supplied with basic fuel, rules can lose their persuasive charm. Of course, not every wood thief is a desperate parent protecting children from winter. Some people are simply opportunistic. Scarcity attracts profit. If wood becomes valuable, stolen wood can be sold. A person with access to a cart can remove more than a person carrying bundles by hand. Someone with authority can abuse it. A woodward charged with protecting trees may face accusations of favoritism or corruption. A wealthy tenant may quietly take more than custom permits, while poorer villagers are punished for smaller amounts. Resources create power. Power creates arguments. Arguments create paperwork, assuming the clerk has not already wandered away in despair. You also begin seeing deliberate concealment. Wood is cut at dusk. Branches are hidden beneath straw. Bundles are carried along less visible paths. Freshly cut ends are smeared with mud. Small pieces disappear beneath cloaks or inside baskets. A quirky detail from medieval and later woodland offences is how specific accusations can become. Records may distinguish taking branches, underwood, timber, bark, or particular numbers of loads. The language becomes precise because every category has different value. One person is not merely accused of stealing wood. They may be accused of cutting several young trees or carrying away a particular load of underwood. Apparently even illegal sticks require inventory management. The atmosphere becomes worse when outsiders enter the picture. Suppose inhabitants of a neighbouring settlement begin collecting from land your village considers its customary resource. Your internal quarrels suddenly become collective outrage. People who spent yesterday accusing each other of theft can unite instantly against somebody from 3 miles away. Human solidarity is wonderfully efficient when provided with the correct stranger. A group confronts gatherers near the woodland edge. Voices rise. Nobody draws a weapon, but tools are visible. Axes, hooks, staffs, and knives are normal working objects. That makes angry encounters more dangerous. Village authorities or respected householders may intervene because escalation threatens everyone. Violence disrupts work. Injury removes labour from households. Feuds can last years. So communities have strong incentives to settle small disputes before they become large ones. Compromise appears. Perhaps outsiders receive limited access. Perhaps collection days are assigned. Perhaps disputed ground is inspected. Perhaps old witnesses are asked what they remember. Elderly villagers suddenly become valuable archives. A man who cannot remember where he put his cup can apparently remember exactly where a boundary hedge stood 40 years ago. Everyone listens anyway. Custom depends heavily on collective memory, but memory is rarely neutral. A household remembers rights generously. Its neighbour remembers restrictions clearly. The Lord's official remembers fees with supernatural accuracy. Historians still argue whether local courts mainly protected communal order in disputes over natural resources, or whether they more often strengthened elite control by defining customary practices in ways favourable to landlords. The evidence supports no single easy answer. Courts can defend villagers against encroachment. They can also punish villagers. Communities can use legal institutions to protect shared resources. Powerful people can use those same institutions to restrict access. The meaning depends on who controls the process and whose testimony carries weight. For you, the effect is immediate. You become cautious. Every branch requires context. Every hedge has a history. Every path crosses somebody's claim. You may possess a legal right and still provoke hostility. You may break no written rule and violate local expectation. You may follow custom exactly and discover that two neighbours remember the custom differently. The landscape has become socially crowded. Trees do not stand alone. Invisible boundaries surround them. You begin marking your own fuel more carefully. Bundles are tied differently. Stacks move closer to the house. Children are told not to lend sticks without permission. A damaged gate is repaired quickly. Trust still exists, but it now requires supervision. Then comes the accusation that truly unsettles people. Someone has cut a young tree, not dead wood, not brush. A living sapling, the stump is fresh and the cut is clean. Nobody admits responsibility. This feels different because young trees represent future supply. Taking one is not merely removing today's fuel, it is removing tomorrow's growth. Villagers gather around the stump. People speculate. They identify tool marks with far more confidence than evidence deserves. Someone knows exactly which household owns an axe of that width. Someone else says every axe in the village is that width. The accused household reacts angrily. Within minutes, the tree has produced 6 theories, 3 insults, and 1 deeply unnecessary comment about somebody's grandfather. The incident reveals the real danger. Scarcity can damage cooperation faster than it damages woodland. A village survives difficult seasons through shared labour and mutual dependence. Once every household treats every other household as a possible thief, the social machinery begins grinding. You feel it at dusk. Doors close more firmly. Fuel stacks disappear behind fences. People ask where bundles came from. A cart arriving with wood attracts attention. The village remains a community, but warmth now carries suspicion with it. You walk past the disputed branch from the morning. It is gone. Your neighbour has taken it. You discover that you are still irritated. Then you notice a smaller stick beside the lane. You pick it up quickly. Nobody sees. At least you hope nobody sees. You carry it home while telling yourself that this is completely different. And somewhere behind a shutter, someone may already be counting. You stop looking at the woodland as a collection of trees. You begin looking at it as a machine that can be managed. That sounds rather grand for a place full of mud, roots, birds, thorns, and one squirrel that appears to have appointed itself supervisor. But the change in thinking matters. If people simply cut whatever looks useful, the supply collapses. If they cut carefully and allow regrowth, the same patch of land can produce fuel again and again. So the village begins treating trees less like one-time objects and more like living resources. The first technique you notice is coppicing. A tree is cut low near the ground. That sounds destructive. Then something unexpected happens. The stump survives. New shoots rise from it. Several stems may grow where one trunk stood. Years pass. Those stems thicken. Then they are cut again. The cycle repeats. This works especially well with certain species that respond vigorously after cutting. Hazel, willow, ash, chestnut in suitable regions. Other species can be managed similarly depending on soil, climate, and local practice. The result is not a dark forest of towering untouched trunks. It is a deliberately shaped woodland divided by age. One area has fresh shoots. Another holds waist-high growth. Another contains mature poles ready for cutting. You walk through it and suddenly understand that what looks irregular is actually organized. The woodland has a schedule. Coppicing is a mainstream and important form of traditional woodland management in medieval and later Europe. It allows communities and landowners to produce repeated harvests of small wood for fuel, fencing, tools, baskets, and other uses while keeping the root system alive. The crucial word is repeated. A felled mature tree may take decades to replace from seed. A healthy coppice stool can send up new shoots much faster. You stand beside one. Several straight stems rise from the same broad base. They look almost like a wooden fountain. One villager cuts a pole, another counts the remaining stems. Nobody clears the whole patch. That restraint is the technology. You begin learning that cutting everything at once would be foolish. Instead, the woodland may be divided into compartments. One compartment is cut this year, another next year, another later. By the time the cycle returns to the first, new growth may be ready. The length of that cycle varies according to species, desired product, and local conditions. Thin rods require fewer years. Thicker poles require more. The woodland becomes a calendar you can walk through. A patch of young shoots represents future fencing. A stand of thicker poles represents fuel several winters away. Older standards rise above them, reserved for larger timber. You glance upward. Those taller trees are deliberately left standing while the smaller coppice beneath them is harvested. This arrangement, often called coppice with standards, allows one area to provide both small regularly harvested wood and larger timber over longer periods. It is a clever compromise. You need poles often, you need beams occasionally. The same woodland can provide both. If people resist cutting the large trees every time somebody sees a magnificent piece of potential firewood, that final part requires discipline. A straight oak trunk looks extremely tempting when fuel is scarce. But burning valuable construction timber is like heating your home with furniture you have not built yet. Possible, not ideal. So rules become more precise. Certain trees are marked. Certain compartments are closed. Cutting occurs at chosen times. People are told not to graze animals on new shoots. This last rule produces immediate resentment from the goats. Young coppice growth is tender. Livestock can damage it badly. If cattle, sheep, deer, or goats browse repeatedly on new shoots, the regeneration that makes the whole system work may fail. So fresh coppice may need protection. Fences go up. Animals are excluded. A woodland manager who successfully keeps goats away from delicious new growth deserves at least a minor sainthood. The village also uses pollarding. At first, it resembles coppicing performed by someone who forgot where the ground is. Instead of cutting a tree near the base, people cut the trunk or major branches higher up, above the reach of many grazing animals. New shoots grow from the elevated head. Those shoots can later be harvested. The trunk remains standing. You look at an old pollarded tree and understand why ancient managed trees can develop such strange shapes. The trunk is thick and gnarled. Above it, multiple limbs emerge from a swollen crown. It looks less like a conventional tree and more like a wooden fist holding a bouquet of branches. Pollarding can be particularly useful where animals graze beneath trees. The livestock use the ground. The tree continues producing wood overhead. One landscape supports both. You begin noticing old pollards near pastures and boundaries. Some survive for centuries when maintained. Their hollow trunks can become habitats for insects, birds, bats, and fungi. There is your quirky woodland tidbit. A tree shaped repeatedly by human cutting can eventually become more ecologically interesting precisely because it grows old, hollow, scarred, and structurally peculiar. The village sees fuel. A beetle sees luxury housing. Management becomes a balance between current use and future growth. That means somebody must think beyond this winter. You hate this immediately. Future planning is always easier when the present is comfortable. When people are cold, a 10-year rotation sounds less persuasive than a tree standing directly in front of you. So enforcement matters. A woodward may supervise cutting. The manor may regulate compartments. Villagers may hold customary expectations about which areas are available and when. A community may agree informally to protect young growth. The exact arrangement varies. What matters is that regrowth becomes a shared interest. You join a work group clearing a coppice compartment. The cutting is selective. Branches are sorted. Straight poles go into one pile. Smaller fuel wood goes into another. Flexible rods may be reserved for weaving fences or baskets. Twigs can become kindling. Bark may have uses depending on species and local crafts. Nothing about the tree is treated casually. You discover that woodland management is not merely about producing more wood. It is about producing different kinds of wood. A basket maker wants thin, flexible rods. A builder wants long, straight poles. A household wants fuel. A carpenter wants larger timber. A fence repair needs stakes. The best system recognizes that a branch useful for one purpose might be wasted in another. This requires knowledge passed through generations. People learn when to cut, where to cut, which stools respond well, how many stems to leave, how to protect regrowth, which trees tolerate repeated cutting, what soil produces good poles. The knowledge does not require botanical textbooks. It exists in routine. An older worker points at a stool and tells you not to cut too low. Another tells you not to damage the bark around the base. Someone else knows that a particular wet patch produces willow exceptionally well. You begin to realize that the woodland contains expertise as surely as it contains timber. Hedges are managed too. Instead of allowing a hedge to grow wildly until it collapses, villagers can cut, lay, trim, and renew it. Hedge laying bends and partially cuts stems so they continue growing while forming a dense barrier. The exact techniques vary by region, and later traditions develop highly distinctive local styles. For you, the important result is practical. A maintained hedge can restrain animals and produce regular trimmings. Those trimmings become useful fuel. A boundary that once competed with the hearth begins contributing to it. You help trim one carefully. The difference between maintenance and destruction becomes obvious. Cut too much and the hedge weakens. Cut properly and it thickens. You gather the removed material, suddenly a chore produces both fencing and firewood. The village starts finding other ways to combine purposes. Trees may stand along field edges. Willows grow near water. Pollards rise in pasture. Small woods occupy land poorly suited to crops. Branches are harvested without removing every trunk. Even scattered trees become part of the energy system. The landscape turns into a patchwork of production. Not forest here and field there. More like trees threaded through farming. This matters because medieval land use is often mixed. Woodland can support grazing. Fields can contain boundary trees. Pastures can hold pollards. Streams can support willows. The neat modern separation between forestry and agriculture does not always fit. You live in a landscape where one patch may provide fodder, fuel, shade, fencing material, grazing, and timber depending on season and management. Efficiency grows from overlap. Then comes the hardest rule. Wait. Some coppice areas must simply be left alone. You walk past young stems knowing they would burn. You do not cut them. The sight is almost painful. They are fuel in visible form. But cutting them too early produces little wood and weakens the future harvest. So you protect them. This is where resource management becomes social rather than purely technical. Any individual household can gain by cheating. If you secretly cut young poles tonight, you receive fuel. The cost is spread across everyone who expected those poles to mature. The temptation is obvious. The solution requires trust, surveillance, custom, penalties, or some combination of all four. Historians still argue whether medieval woodland management systems worked mainly because communities developed strong shared norms, or because landlords and officials imposed effective control from above. Both forces can matter. Some woods are tightly managed by estates seeking revenue. Some customary systems depend heavily on village cooperation. Some arrangements produce bitter conflict while still preserving the resource. Success does not require harmony. Sometimes it requires everyone agreeing to be annoyed by the same rules. You notice one more thing. Managed woodland does not necessarily look like what a modern visitor imagines a natural forest should look like. Coppiced areas can appear open and bright shortly after cutting. Then dense growth returns. Different compartments create different habitats. Pollards look distorted. Standard trees stand at uneven intervals. Hedges form long green walls. To someone unfamiliar with the system, the landscape might look damaged. To the people depending on it, it looks productive. The measure of success is not untouched beauty. It is whether wood returns. Years begin to matter differently. A bundle gathered today solves one evening. A protected stool may solve many future evenings. A properly managed hectare of woodland can keep producing material if harvesting stays within the capacity of regrowth. That principle sounds obvious. Living by it is harder. You stand with a billhook in your hand beside a young tree you have been told not to cut. The branch would fit perfectly beneath your arm. Nobody appears to be watching. Then you hear movement. The squirrel. Supervisor. You leave the branch. Not because of the squirrel. Mostly. You return toward the houses carrying only the material assigned from the cutting. The bundle is not enormous. But something has changed. The wood no longer feels like the last remains of a disappearing resource. It feels like part of a cycle. Cut. Regrow. Protect. Wait. Cut again. The process is slow. It requires memory longer than one season. It requires rules that survive individual need. It requires believing that people who are not yet cold will still need warmth years from now. Around you, the woodland carries evidence of that belief. Fresh stools wait beneath the winter sky. Young shoots stand untouched. Old pollards stretch knotted limbs above grazing ground. Tall standards rise over smaller growth. The landscape has learned to produce wood without being erased. And you, reluctantly, are learning that the most valuable tree is not always the one you can burn tonight. You hear the cart long before you see it. Wooden wheels groan somewhere beyond the village lane. Hooves strike frozen ground. A driver mutters encouragement to an animal that appears to have developed strong opinions about uphill transport. Then the cart comes into view. It is loaded with wood, not a handful, not a bundle tucked beneath one arm, an actual load. People emerge from doorways almost immediately. Nobody announces the arrival. Nobody needs to. A cart full of fuel has become more interesting than gossip. You walk closer. The wood does not come from the nearby fields or familiar woodland. It has travelled from farther away, from a place where trees remain plentiful enough for someone to cut them, load them, transport them, and still expect to make money. That final part changes everything. Fuel is becoming merchandise. You inspect the load. Some pieces are split. Others remain in rough lengths. The driver explains where the wood came from, though naturally the distance grows slightly every time he describes the difficulty of the journey. Perhaps the forest is 6 miles away. By the time negotiations begin, it appears to have crossed 3 mountain ranges and survived a dragon. Transport gives wood a price beyond the tree itself. Someone must fell it. Someone must cut it to manageable size. Someone must load it. A horse or ox must pull it. A cart must survive the road. The driver must spend time travelling. Animals must be fed. Wheels must be repaired. Tolls may appear along certain routes. Every inconvenience attaches itself to the final bundle. You ask the price. You regret asking the price. A household that once gathers much of its fuel through labour now faces a different calculation. Do you have coin? Perhaps you can trade grain. Perhaps eggs. Perhaps cloth. Perhaps labour. But the person who brings wood from a distance has a little reason to surrender it cheaply. Other households want the same load. Scarcity has created a market. This is a mainstream historical pattern in growing medieval towns and wood-poor regions. As nearby fuel supplies become insufficient, wood and charcoal increasingly move through commercial networks, sometimes over considerable distances. Cities make this especially visible. A large town contains thousands of people who cannot simply wander into a nearby hedge whenever they need fuel. They buy it. Merchants organize supply. Carts enter through gates. Boats unload timber and firewood. Charcoal travels from wooded hinterlands toward consumers. Your village now begins participating in a smaller version of that system. You watch neighbours bargain with the driver, just one wants a quarter load, another asks for several large pieces. A baker wants enough to justify heating an oven. A household with little coin offers goods instead. The driver knows exactly how badly everyone needs what he carries. His expression develops the calm serenity of a man standing beside the only pie at a hungry festival. You begin appreciating transportation routes in an entirely new way. A muddy track is no longer merely an unpleasant place to lose a shoe. It is an energy artery. If carts can travel reliably, distant woodland becomes useful. If roads become impassable, that same woodland might as well lie across an ocean. Winter creates trouble. Frozen roads can sometimes become firmer and easier for heavy loads. Thaws turn them into mud. Heavy rain cuts ruts deeper. A broken bridge interrupts traffic. A damaged wheel leaves valuable fuel sitting beside the road, while the driver invents vocabulary that would disappoint the parish priest. Transport by water can be much more efficient. Where rivers are navigable, heavy materials can travel farther with less effort than over poor roads. Timber may be floated downstream. Firewood can be carried in boats or barges. Large logs can even be assembled into rafts in some regions. Water does much of the carrying. You visit a riverside landing where fuel arrives from upstream. The scene is busy. Men pull at ropes. A boat nudges the bank. Stacks of wood wait on damp ground. Someone keeps count. Someone else disagrees with the count. A third person has somehow become angry about the length of a log. Commerce is functioning perfectly. You help unload. The wood feels wonderfully solid in your hands. Each piece has travelled farther than you usually walk in a day. The river connects your cold hearth to a forest you may never see. That is the quiet power of trade. It stretches the practical landscape. Local scarcity no longer means the only available resource is local. But distance never disappears. It turns into cost. The farther the wood travels, the more labour and transport it absorbs. That helps explain why bulky, low-value fuel tends to come from relatively nearby whenever possible. Moving ordinary firewood across long distances by land can become prohibitively expensive. Charcoal offers one solution, by converting wood near the source into a lighter, more concentrated fuel. Suppliers can transport useful heating value more efficiently for activities requiring intense heat. So charcoal burners may work close to forests while merchants carry the finished charcoal towards smithies, towns, and workshops. You see sacks arriving on a cart. They look easier to transport than equivalent loads of raw wood. They are also dirty. Charcoal dust settles on hands, clothes, faces, and apparently every object within philosophical distance. One carrier looks as if he has personally argued with a chimney and lost. Fuel merchants begin occupying an increasingly important position. They know where supplies remain. They know which roads work. They know who owns carts. They know when river levels allow transport. They know which customers pay reliably. Information becomes almost as useful as muscle. A merchant who learns that woodland 10 miles away has been opened for cutting can arrange purchases quickly. Another might contract with an estate. Someone else buys charcoal from producers and resells it in smaller quantities. You begin seeing specialization. Not everyone who sells wood cuts it. Not everyone who transports it owns the woodland. The chain grows longer. Owner, cutter, carrier, merchant, buyer. Each person takes something from the transaction. By the time fuel reaches your hands, you're paying for an entire journey. This can produce uncomfortable differences between households. A prosperous farmer buys a substantial load and stacks it beneath shelter. A poorer family buys a small bundle. Another household cannot buy anything. Markets solve the problem of distance. They do not solve the problem of poverty. You feel this clearly when prices rise. Perhaps a storm blocks a road. Perhaps winter demand increases. Perhaps an estate restricts cutting. Perhaps carts are needed elsewhere. Suddenly fewer loads reach the village. The wood that does arrive becomes more expensive. People complain that merchants are exploiting the shortage. Merchants complain that transport costs have risen. Both may be telling the truth. That is the deeply irritating feature of economics. Two people can be miserable at the same time. Authorities sometimes try to regulate fuel markets, especially in towns where access to affordable firewood or charcoal is politically important. Measurements matter. Weights matter. Bundle sizes matter. A buyer wants to know that a supposedly standard load actually contains what was promised. A seller has incentives to arrange the stack creatively. A quirky historical detail is that firewood can be measured by standardized piles, loads, or local units, whose exact dimensions vary considerably by place. This sounds sensible until you realize that medieval Europe possesses enough local measures to make buying wood feel like solving a puzzle designed by several neighbouring villages that refuse to speak to each other. You examine one merchant's bundle. It looks generous from the front, less impressive from the side. You've learned. You walk around it. The merchant looks disappointed. Commercial fuel also creates storage problems. If you buy a large quantity, you must keep it dry. Wood stacked directly against wet ground deteriorates. Rain reduces its usefulness. Theft remains possible. So households with sheds, yards, and secure storage gain another advantage. Buying in summer may be wiser than waiting until the coldest part of the winter. Seasoned wood burns better. Prices may also vary with demand. Planning becomes part of household survival. You save coin when possible. You watch incoming carts. You learn which merchants are reliable. You begin asking travellers about road conditions. News about distant woodland suddenly matters. A forest several miles away becomes part of your daily life without ever entering your view. So does the nearest town. Urban demand can pull fuel away from surrounding countryside. A town with many hearths, workshops, ovens, breweries, and industries may offer merchants better prices than a small village. Your community is therefore competing not merely with neighbouring households, but with consumers miles away. A cart driver may pass your lane entirely if the town market pays more. You watch one do exactly that. Several villagers call out. The driver waves. The cart keeps moving. There are few sights more educational than your winter fuel continuing cheerfully towards someone richer. Historians still argue whether expanding medieval fuel markets generally reduce the danger of local shortages by connecting consumers with distant supplies, or whether commercialization sometimes worsened inequality by allowing wealthier towns and households to outbid poorer rural users. Again, both effects can exist. Trade increases total access. Trade also gives purchasing power greater importance. A community with little coin may live close to supply and still struggle. A wealthy consumer can reach farther through the market. Your relationship with the landscape changes as a result. Warmth no longer depends entirely on what your own feet can reach. It depends on roads, rivers, animals, markets, prices, contracts, strangers. You hand over payment for several pieces of wood. The merchant places them beside you. The exchange feels almost absurd. You have purchased trees you never saw from land you cannot name, transported by people you do not know. Yet tonight those distant trees will become your fire. You carry the pieces home one by one. They're dry, dense, reliable. You stack them carefully beneath shelter. Each log represents more than fuel now. It represents a network. The road outside grows quiet again. The cart moves toward another settlement. Its wheels fade into the distance. You look at your purchase stack and realise that the village has crossed an invisible threshold. Warmth is no longer merely gathered from the surrounding countryside. It travels. It is measured. It is bargained over. It has a price. And somewhere beyond the horizon, another axe falls because someone here is willing to pay for the sound. You begin noticing the village has acquired rules nobody bothered to state quite so carefully when fuel was easy to find. A bell does not ring to announce an environmental awakening. Nobody gathers beneath an oak and declares that humanity has discovered sustainability. Instead, practical restrictions appear. This patch may not be cut yet. Those young shoots must be protected. Only certain households may gather on a particular day. A fallen limb can be taken, but a living stem cannot. A cartload requires permission. A hedge must not be stripped beyond a certain point. The rules sound tedious. That is because survival often wears the costume of tedious administration. You walk toward the woodland with several villagers and find small marks on selected trees. Some are intended to remain standing. Others may be cut when the proper season arrives. A local official or experienced woodman keeps track of which areas are ready for use. The woodland no longer feels like an open cupboard. It feels like a storehouse with an inventory. People begin thinking in quantities. How many loads can this patch provide? How quickly will growth return? How much must remain untouched? Which households have legitimate claims? What material should be reserved for repairs? Those questions are not modern inventions. Medieval communities and landholders can be intensely concerned with regulating forests, woods, commons, and other valuable resources. Woodland ordinances, customary rules, manorial oversight, and local agreements can all restrict how resources are taken. That is a mainstream historical fact. The precise system differs from place to place, but the basic motivation is easy to understand. If everybody takes as much as possible today, there may be nothing useful tomorrow. You dislike the rule most when it applies to you. A section of woodland stands full of promising young growth. You could use it. You're told to leave it. The trees seem almost insulting in their availability. There they are. Wood, visible wood, yet the point is that they are not ready. A young stem burned now gives little heat. Allowed to mature, it yields far more. You therefore practice one of humanity's least favourite skills, restraint. The village also begins as watching the season. Certain cutting may be concentrated during colder months when sap levels are lower and agricultural workloads differ. Timber felled at suitable times can season before heavy use. Branches are stacked under cover. Wood is raised from wet soil. Air is allowed to move around it. People who once treated storage as an afterthought become remarkably particular about it. Dry fuel burns more efficiently, so a better stack effectively increases the usefulness of what you already possess. You help construct a simple shelter. The roof keeps rain off. The sides remain open enough for ventilation. Several households copy the idea. Soon, neat piles appear beside cottages. The stacks become symbols of competence. A poorly arranged pile now attracts the same quiet judgment once reserved for badly maintained fences. You catch yourself examining a neighbour's stack, very crooked, concerning. You are becoming unbearable. Households begin planning farther ahead. Fuel gathering shifts towards seasons when other labour permits it. A family tries to build reserves before cold weather arrives. Children collect small dry material during ordinary journeys rather than waiting until crisis forces a special trip. Repair scraps are saved. Usable offcuts are sorted rather than discarded. The point is not desperation now. It is prevention. That distinction changes the mood. When the first cool nights arrive, you no longer immediately fear the bottom of the pile. You know approximately what has been stored. You know what remains available. You know which sources must be left untouched. Uncertainty shrinks. The shortage has taught everyone that abundance can be misleading. A landscape full of trees does not automatically mean limitless fuel. Trees require years to grow. people can consume them far faster. So woodland starts entering village decision-making in a more deliberate way. A proposed new field receives greater scrutiny. Clearing trees creates arable land, but people now ask what else will be lost. Fuel, shade, grazing opportunities, timber, boundary material, perhaps animal fodder. A wooded patch possesses several values at once. Cutting it for one purpose destroys the others. That does not mean woodland clearance stops. Food remains essential, population changes, economic pressures remain, but the decision becomes harder to treat as free. You have learned that every acre has consequences. The physical landscape gradually reflects this thinking. Certain slopes remain wooded because cultivating them would be difficult. Trees survive beside streams. Managed groves occupy patches unsuitable for grain. Hedges grow thicker where people maintain them carefully. Scattered trees remain in pasture. Young growth is fenced from animals. The village landscape becomes a mosaic. Field, pasture, hedge, wood, meadow, garden, stream. Each piece performs a different task, and many perform several. The result is not untouched wilderness. It is an inhabited environment shaped constantly by human hands. That shaping can damage nature. It can also maintain resources over very long periods when harvesting and regrowth remain balanced. You walk beneath an old pollarded tree whose form records repeated human cutting. Its trunk is thick, its crown spreads strangely. A hollow opens along one side. Inside that hollow, insects live among damp fragments of wood. A bird disappears into a cavity above. The tree is useful precisely because nobody treated usefulness as requiring immediate destruction. A quirky tidbit appears in the strange longevity of certain managed trees. Repeatedly pollarded trees can become exceptionally old because the removal of heavy upper branches reduces some structural stresses, while their hollowing trunks continue living around the outside. A tree shaped for practical reasons can become an ancient landmark. You put a hand against the bark. It may have been cut by people whose names have disappeared. Their decisions still shape your afternoon. Long-term management creates continuity. The person who plants or protects a tree may never burn its branches. Someone else will. That requires a village to think beyond individual households. You see this most clearly when new saplings are planted or deliberately encouraged. Protecting them brings no immediate reward. They are small. They cast almost no useful shade. They produce little fuel. They mostly stand there looking fragile. Yet somebody drives stakes around them. Somebody keeps livestock away. Somebody checks whether they survive. The work benefits people who may not yet exist. That is a surprisingly hopeful activity for a society often imagined as living only from harvest to harvest. Medieval people can plan across generations because buildings, fields, inheritance, orchards, woods, and family property all encourage long horizons. A tree fits naturally into that world. You plant something because a future household will need it. Of course, human nature remains stubbornly human. Rules are still broken. Branches disappear. Someone cuts early. Someone takes more than their share. A household claims exceptional need. Another insists that exception has become habit. There are fines. There are arguments. There is at least one meeting that lasts so long everyone would happily burn the meeting itself if meetings were combustible. Management does not eliminate conflict. It gives conflict boundaries. Instead of arguing over whether anything may be taken, villagers argue over how much, when, and by whom. That is progress of a sort. Even authorities begin valuing predictable supply. A lord who strips woodland completely loses future income. An estate that manages underwood carefully can sell repeated harvests. Fuel users and landowners may disagree over access, but both can benefit from continued growth. Economic self-interest sometimes protects trees more effectively than poetry. A tree does not need to be loved to be conserved. It merely needs to be worth more alive and productive than destroyed once. Historians still argue whether medieval woodland regulation should be understood as an early form of conservation, or primarily as economic management designed to protect property and revenue. The word conservation can be misleading if it suggests modern environmental values. People are usually protecting usefulness, rights, hunting, timber, grazing, income, or future supply. Yet the practical outcome can still preserve wooded landscapes. Motives and effects do not always match neatly. You do not need anyone to possess modern ecological language. You need enough people to recognize a limit. The village recognizes one. That lesson reaches beyond wood. Pasture can be overgrazed. Soil can be exhausted. Water sources can be fouled. Hedges can be ruined. Game can be depleted. A community living close to local resources cannot pretend consequences happen somewhere invisible. They appear in walking distance. You see the stump. You feel the colder room. You carry the heavier bundle. Feedback arrives personally. That does not guarantee wisdom. People can understand a problem and still make terrible choices, but consequences become difficult to ignore. Several winters pass. The change is gradual. Young shoots become poles. Protected trees thicken. Some neglected patches recover. Fuel remains valuable, but panic eases where management succeeds. The village has not discovered an endless supply. It has discovered something more useful, a rate. Take only as quickly as the landscape can replace. The principle sounds simple enough to fit into one sentence. Living by it requires years. You notice newcomers learning the rules. A child is corrected for breaking a young branch. A teenager learns which wood may be gathered. A newly married household is shown where its customary rights apply. Knowledge enters routine. Soon nobody remembers when certain practices first felt unusual. They are simply how things are done. That may be the most durable result of the crisis. Not a dramatic law, not a monument, a habit. You stack wood beneath a shelter as evening settles over the roofs. The pieces are dry. The quantity is finite. You know that. You also know where replacements are growing. Beyond the houses, fields darken beneath the lowering sky. Hedges trace the boundaries. Managed trees stand along the pasture. Woodland occupies the slope where generations of cutting have shaped it without erasing it. Smoke begins rising from hearths. The site no longer feels careless. Each plume represents material somebody has gathered, stored, purchased, allocated, or grown. The village still burns wood. It still consumes. But consumption has acquired memory. People remember what happens when the pile reaches its final pieces, and that memory teaches them to look at a young tree and see something invisible. A winter that has not arrived yet. Word Count Fionn, who had a fuff of 84. Night settles softly now. You leave the woodpile beneath its little roof and close the door behind you. The cottage is quiet. A small fire glows in the hearth, neither fierce nor weak, simply steady. You sit close enough to feel its warmth across your hands. Outside, the village rests beneath a dark sky. The fields have become broad shadows. The hedges are only lines. The woodland stands farther away, calm and almost black beneath the stars. Nothing needs to be solved tonight. The trees are growing at their own patient pace. Roots hold quietly beneath the soil. Young branches wait for spring. Rain will come. Leaves will return. Years will pass through the rings of trunks without hurry. You breathe slowly. The fire gives a tiny crack. One ember folds inward. Another glows red beneath pale ash. There is enough warmth for this moment. That is all you need. The voices of the village fade. A door closes somewhere down the lane. An animal shifts in its shelter. Wind moves lightly through the branches, making a soft sound that rises and falls like distant water. You can let the numbers go now. No counting bundles. No measuring loads. No worrying about tomorrow's fuel. The wood is stacked. The hearth is safe. The room grows quieter. Your shoulders loosen. Your breathing becomes slower. Imagine the village shrinking gently into darkness, roof by roof, field by field, until only a few faint orange windows remain. Then those too become dim. The trees continue standing, the embers continue glowing, and you can simply rest beside them, warm enough, sheltered enough, while the long medieval night passes without asking anything more of you.